Okay. Tom, welcome to these conversations we're having here at the Atlantic Council, the Transatlantic Debriefs. Quick 6 questions. First one, Chancellor Scholz was just in Washington, and his visit has really dominated the news cycle here in DC, especially with what's going on in Ukraine. And I think the kind of broad perception here in Washington that Germany has been slow to react and to sort of step up to what needs to be happening. So it's here, the visit's been seen sort of as a course correction for the last couple of months. How has the visit played out both in Germany and across Europe?
I guess you wouldn't quite hear it described as a course correction, but I think certainly people would acknowledge, even people in Scholz's circle would acknowledge that this was a necessary trip, perhaps even a belated trip. You'll know better than I will that the American press has been full of stuff accusing Germany of being an unreliable ally, of Olaf Scholz's party, the Social Democrats, being stuffed to the hilt with Putin sympathizers and all the rest of it. And I think there was a clear feeling that the Chancellor needed to regain the initiative here. And I think that's pretty clear when you look at what he did when he was in Washington. Not only, of course, the one-to-one meeting with Joe Biden, which lasted for over an hour, and I know from the German side at least that they were very happy with how that meeting went, but also with some of the media appearances. There was a live interview on CNN. I think that's the first time a German chancellor has ever done that, live in English on an American news channel, interview with the Washington Post. And also, importantly, there was a dinner with a bipartisan group of senators. And this is important, we might get onto this. This is important because the Senate has been crucial in the discussions in the US on responding to the notorious Democrats who are concerned that Germany has been too sympathetic to Russia in allowing this pipeline to go ahead. And his own desire to ensure that Germany remains a strong ally as part of the American need to bolster, as part of the American need to maintain strong transatlantic unity against the Russian threat. So that's been a very difficult issue for Joe Biden. So I think it was an important gesture for Olaf Scholz to go in, talk to these senators, explain the German position. And according to some of the reports I've seen anyway, the senators from both sides came out saying that they were utterly charmed by Olaf Scholz and emerged with a better, clearer understanding of the German position than they had before. So at least on the German side, I think there's a pretty strong feeling that this trip was all in all a success.
Was there nervousness basically in the German public ahead of this trip that Scholz had lost the initiative and sort of had lost the narrative that Germany was looking bad and then therefore that's a success? Was there a broad sort of shared feeling about that?
I think so, yes. I mean, in the domestic context, it's tied in with a whole bunch of stuff that's been going on, or rather not going on inside the country. So there was one German newspaper that described Scholz as the invisible chancellor, simply because he had been so absent on pretty much every big issue confronting the country ever since he took office in December. So in particular, issues around the management of the pandemic. There's a debate in Germany on whether or not to introduce compulsory vaccination for adults. And Olaf Scholz has said before he took office in November, he had said that he was in favor of introducing such a mandate. But then after taking office, he sort of pushed responsibility for this onto the parliament and didn't want to lead the debate in any way. And some people were upset by that. So when people observed this kind of peculiar absence, the Chancellor's absence from the global stage on coming up with some sort of response to what was happening with this Russia-Ukraine crisis, it felt kind of a piece with what was happening here. And so I think, yes, that things maybe have started to shift a little bit just this week because, first of all, this visit to the US, which was very important, but that actually marks the beginning of a whole kind of burst of diplomacy, a rather belated burst of diplomacy. The US first, but then we've had a meeting of the long moribund so-called Weimar Triangle, which brings together the leaders of Germany, France, and Poland. Olaf Scholz is hosting the leaders of the Baltic states. And then on February the 14th, he will be going to Kiev to meet President Zelensky one day before making his inaugural visit as Chancellor to Moscow to see Vladimir Putin on January the 15th. So the gears are starting to crank up a lot later than a lot of people would have liked. But, Germany is a complicated, slow country. This is a new government with an untested coalition. So talk to people around Olaf Scholz and they will say, look, everything is fine on substance. We just might need a little bit more time to get things moving than other countries would like.
Could you address, you said something earlier, which I think is exactly correct. In American media, there's a lot of speculation about, more broadly about the coalition, but also, of Scholz's own party, the SPD, the sort of long legacy of Ostpolitik and how they basically view this. So Scholz is saying that, this is just basically working out the kinks in it. From your perspective over there, reporting on it, are there tensions within the party? Is that completely just an overblown story? Is Scholz needing to manage, different viewpoints within it? And how's that actually playing out? Similarly, let me add, we didn't mention the Greens as well. And Foreign Minister Baerbock, represents one facet of the Greens, but there's another facet of the Greens. So I don't know, maybe can you talk a little bit about that, the sense of internal party politics in this complicated coalition?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think it's quite telling that when the three parties in the coalition, that the SPD, the Greens, and also a small pro-business party, the Free Democrats, when they were negotiating their coalition treaty, which is sort of a post-election ritual in Germany, when they were discussing foreign policy, Russia was by far the trickiest issue that they came across. There were big differences between the parties on Russia and on Nord Stream 2. Now, they came to an arrangement, which they have to do. But I don't think they expected their compromise to be tested as quickly as it has been. And that's one reason, I think, why the response has been a bit slow and a little bit incoherent to start with. So to talk about these two parties, well, the SPD, yeah, I do think that some of the criticism has been overblown in the sense that, if you read some of the wilder fringes of American commentary, you can almost come away with the impression that the SPD is in effect a kind of Russian Trojan horse and has made sort of Berlin an ally of Moscow's. Now, that's a long way from the truth. But there clearly are tensions within the party. There are disagreements within the party. It's a huge kind of stone in the shoe of the SPD that the previous Social Democratic Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who left office in 2005 when he was defeated by Angela Merkel, has now become basically a Russian gas lobbyist. And on Friday, with almost comic timing, Gazprom announced that they wanted Gerhard Schröder to join their board. And he's still a prominent figure. He's not a powerful figure inside the SPD, but he is, as an ex-chancellor, he's a prominent figure in the German political landscape. Every other day, there's a headline involving Gerhard Schröder saying something untoward about Russia or Ukraine, and it is certainly unhelpful for the party. There are other figures within it who have said unhelpful things, who have taken up unhelpful positions, by which I mean unhelpful to the government. And actually, about 10 days ago, one of the co-leaders of the party, Lars Klingbeil, convened a kind of a way day of the SPD to help thrash out some of these issues so that they can arrive at a more coherent position and stop providing their enemies with ammunition, essentially. And I do think that you are seeing that approach is starting to bear fruit now. We don't see members of the government or senior MPs or whatever freelancing on Russia to the extent that we were seeing, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think something is starting to happen there. On the Greens, I wouldn't exaggerate the differences there. People have long got used to talking about realos and fundis inside the Green Party, sort of, moderates and less moderates perhaps in the party. But the Greens are now pretty united on what has been a fairly hawkish line towards Russia, at least in German terms. That doesn't involve doing things like sending weapons to the Ukrainians. The Greens are fundamentally opposed to that. In fact, every party is opposed to that. But it does mean taking a very assertive stance against Nord Stream 2. It does mean speaking up assertively against Vladimir Putin and other autocrats and human rights violators. And interesting, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, has been far more active diplomatically than Olaf Scholz, at least until this week. She's been in Ukraine twice. She's been over to Washington to see Antony Blinken. She's been to see Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. She was even on the front line in the Donbass this week, and generally seems to have been performing fairly well. The foreign minister's room for maneuver is limited. A lot of foreign policy decision-making power is concentrated inside the Chancellery. But so far, early days, Annalena Baerbock seems to be doing a fairly good job. She has her party firmly united behind her. So if you're looking for kind of internal political difficulties inside Germany, you need to look at differences between the parties and problems inside the SPD. They are real, but I do think that they're starting to get on top of them, and a more coherent approach is now starting to emerge.
No, that's terrific. I mean, maybe just a quick follow-up on that. I think it's really interesting what you say about, Foreign Minister Baerbock really taking the lead on this. To what extent, I mean, to sort of get a layperson who doesn't really understand, to what extent is foreign policy embedded in the Chancellery, or is it just that Angela Merkel was such a strong chancellor that she brought a lot of it in? Can this shift over time?
It's a really good question for exactly the reason that you gave. Angela Merkel was chancellor for 16 years. There were many foreign ministers in that period, and they were basically ineffectual to varying degrees, I think it's fair to say. The last incumbent, a guy called Heiko Maas from the Social Democrats, was pretty invisible and was pretty unpopular even inside his own ministry. So that was one of the questions when this new government took office. Would Annalena Baerbock, who is ambitious, she was the co-leader for her party and even the candidate for the Chancellery, would she be able to, in effect, wrest back some foreign policy decision-making away from the Chancellery and towards the foreign ministry, particularly given that Olaf Scholz, although he's a very experienced politician, does not have a lot of direct experience in foreign policy making. He's never had an office in that sphere. It's obviously too early to give a definitive answer to that question. There are no real signs, I would say, yet of tension between the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry. And there are some personnel decisions on the kind of technical advisor level that seem to have been made with an eye of ensuring that the Foreign Ministry and the Chancellery can work together hand in glove. I think it's probably not a bad thing when you consider the kind of constituencies for both parties, that Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock have a different sort of style and a different approach, as long as they don't go beyond the confines of the coalition treaty, which I don't think either of them have any interest in doing. We will see. I think when it comes to sort of crisis management and high diplomacy, at the end of the day, it's going to be Olaf Scholz who's sitting in a room with Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden and whoever else it is making those decisions, also going to the European Council, the EU decision-making forum. But on certain issues, I can expect Annalena Baerbock to make the running. And I do imagine that the foreign ministry will be invigorated under her leadership. Indeed, talking to some people who work in the ministry, there's now a sense of purpose they feel has been given back to the work that they do that was severely lacking in the days of the coalitions led by Angela Merkel.
So this gets me into sort of one of the last questions I have for you. So Angela Merkel was rightly or wrongly seen as sort of the Putin whisperer for Europe, and I mean, with her experience and understanding and of Russia, and she really did sort of take the lead for Europe. We see right now on the European stage, Emmanuel Macron with his latest visit, especially with France holding the presidency of the European Union, really just making a bid for taking that sort of role. And again, we started off this conversation talking about the sort of the slow rollout of the German government, coalition politics and the rest of that. Is there ambition, would you say, first within the government that Germany, reclaims the role that Angela Merkel throughout her long tenure had carved out for it on the political side? But then also let me ask a second question is, there in Germany, is there an appetite among Germans that Germany take that sort of role? Because after all, Olaf Scholz was elected as a continuity, but also a stable set of hands, not necessarily for his bold visions or leadership. So I don't know, give us a little bit there.
It's an important and a complicated question, I think. So I was based in Brussels when Russia annexed Crimea and sent troops into the Donbass. And after a shaky start, Angela Merkel was absolutely crucial, first of all, in cajoling and bullying and marshalling a common European response, and in particular holding the lines on sanctions. And for EU sanctions, you need unanimity. That's not an easy thing to do. And at the time, people said it wasn't going to last. It did last. It's even lasted till today. That took a lot of people by surprise. That was largely Angela Merkel's doing. She also worked very closely with the then Obama administration in responding to whatever it was that that Russia was doing. And as you said, she was Vladimir Putin's chief, in fact, really his only serious European interlocutor, the only real European leader that he appeared to take seriously. They spoke regularly, in fact, continued to speak regularly over the years through many, many crises. Angela Merkel did not trust Vladimir Putin, but she did believe that it was worth maintaining those diplomatic channels, and he appeared to find it worth his time in talking to her. Now, that's all gone. I don't even think it's crazy to suggest that one of the reasons why Putin may be behaving in the way that he's doing now is that you don't have Merkel in place. You have a new untested German government and a new untested chancellor. I don't think that's the only reason, but I think it may be one of them. So is Olaf Scholz ready to sort of fill the shoes that Angela Merkel left behind? It's too early to say, but I don't have the impression yet that Olaf Scholz sees himself as occupying that sort of indispensable European role that Angela Merkel had. He will do, to a certain extent, simply by dint that Germany is Germany, and any German, the voice of any German chancellor will always carry a lot of weight. But as you say, you know, when Merkel was around in 2014, you had François Hollande, a very weak French president. Now you have Emmanuel Macron, who's a very different sort of figure, of course, going into a re-election campaign, which might be quite tricky himself, and conducting some very assertive diplomacy, speaking with Putin regularly, meeting him in Moscow, coming up with all sorts of ideas for reforming the European security architecture. And I don't detect any concern on the German side with what Macron is doing. And Germany and France, of course, are united in the so-called Normandy format, which brings Germany and France together with Russia and Ukraine to discuss a kind of diplomatic off-ramp from this crisis. But as you will know very well, Emmanuel Macron has never quite been able to get rid of a residue of distrust that surrounds his motives, particularly in large parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, you talk to French officials and they will say that that's very unfair and that his arguments have been misunderstood or misquoted or even mistranslated, you sometimes hear. And then there may well be something to that. But I think that there's a kind of structural problem, which is that France is never going to be able to have the kind of convening power inside the EU that Germany does, regardless of who's in charge. And that is why I think there has been such regret in large parts of Europe so far that Olaf Scholz seems to have been unwilling to adopt the sort of leadership role that Angela Merkel took back in 2014, 2015. Now, that may well emerge. Merkel, of course, at that time had been in office for, 9 years. Olaf Scholz has been in office for 9 weeks. So, you know, this is a very different starting point. But you don't get to choose your crises, you know, and this is the one that he has to confront. And in time, he's going to have to satisfy the demand for some German leadership. I think the fact that he has embarked on this belated but now kind of madcap round of diplomacy inside Europe with America, with Ukraine, with Russia is a sign that he is receptive to the demand for German leadership. And I think you can probably expect to see that pick up, accelerate as the weeks go by. We don't know, of course, what's going to happen on the ground, but there are signs that Germany is waking up to the fact that its allies need to hear a little bit more from it and from its chancellor than they have done in recent weeks. So I think watch that space and you'll start to see a little bit more action on the German side than we have done in recent weeks.
Tom, thank you so much. This was really great.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's hit pause on it and